Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel and I hope you've all been doing well. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at MSI's RTX 3080 Gaming X Trio graphics card. This will be a full-on in-depth review of the graphics card and its performance in various games and applications. I was very fortunate enough to have snagged one of these cards while auto-refreshing online, and couldn't be happier now that I finally have it in my hands. So here it is, my review which you guys have all been waiting for. I worked pretty hard on this review, so I'd appreciate it if y'all could hit that like button and share it with anyone else you think might be interested. To make things interesting, it was decided I will be comparing this card in a head-to-head showdown against MSI's previous generation 2080 Super Gaming X Trio. As a disclaimer, yes, the 3080 is more of a successor to the 2080, but the 2080 Super was barely faster than the former, so this comparison, I should say, is still very much valid, as it will allow us to see how much performance has improved generation on generation. Also, if you're interested in buying this graphics card and like what you see, then I'll have an affiliate link down below in the video description to where you can purchase this RTX 3080 Gaming X Trio for yourself. That is, if it's hopefully in stock. With that said, let's get on with the review. Starting off, I wanted to show you guys a quick unboxing of the graphics card. The graphics card comes inside a fairly large box. I mean, this is a very large graphics card after all. I think packaging and what comes inside the box are some important things to be aware about for a premium product like this, especially since it has a fairly high price tag associated with it. The box it comes in has a picture of the graphics card on the front and has some features listed about it on the back, which we'll discuss in more detail later on in the video. As we open up the box, the graphics card itself and the rest of the contents inside are surrounded by some fairly thick and dense foam that should do a pretty good job in terms of protection and preventing damages during shipping, so I'm glad to see that. First up, we've got an envelope which contains some documentation including warranty information, user guide, and this cool little comic showing you how to install the graphics card. After that, we've got an included GPU brace which helps prevent GPU sag, definitely a necessity for a heavy bulky card like this, so I'm glad to see it included. Then we've got the GPU itself, which comes in a fresh, factory-scented anti-static bag. And that's pretty much it as far as an unboxing goes. Pretty straightforward, the packaging gets its job done, so that's all that really matters. Moving on, let's talk about the design of the graphics card, its aesthetics, and how it compares to its predecessor. One of the first things you'll notice is that MSI has opted to use a fairly simple color scheme for this GPU. Most of the GPU shroud is black with some gray gunmetal accents to complement it. The shroud also has many angular portions, which gives this card a very aggressive and dynamic look. I personally would have liked a simpler and flatter look, but this still works as well for me. Comparing the aesthetics to the previous gen RTX 2080 Super Gaming X Trio, you can see many resemblances between the two cards. MSI definitely brought over many of the design elements that the 2080 Super utilized, such as the black and gray theme, the angular portions, and more. You'll also have noticed the triaxial fan design using MSI's new Torx 4.0 double ball bearing fans, and these fans are quite a bit different from the previous fan designs. Traditionally, MSI has always been using numerous separate fan blades. With the Torx 4.0 design, you have slightly less fan blades, although a bit larger. However, you'll notice that the fan blades are actually joined together on the perimeter, which creates this gap in between the blades that should in theory allow more air to pass through. It'll be difficult to know how much this improves thermal performance without having to isolate the new fans and the old fans and use them to cool the exact same heatsink and cool the same GPU, so we won't know for sure. What I will say though is that under operation, the fans do run very quiet, and as for temperatures, we'll discuss that in more detail later on in the video. The shroud is mostly made out of plastic, but doesn't feel cheap in any way. In fact, most of the build quality is quite robust, and the card is overall very sturdy. The materials used here are fairly high quality and give it a nice premium finish. But definitely be aware of this card's large size. The 3080 Gaming X Trio is 323mm long, 140mm wide, and 56mm in terms of thickness, so it's definitely a bulky card. And if you saw my video where I built my test bench, you'd have seen how I ran into some trouble when installing the card. Surprisingly though, the card is actually slightly shorter than the 2080 Super, which measures 328mm long. Embedded within the GPU shroud, we've got some RGB lighting in the form of some stripes in the center. I have to say the implementation is fairly subtle here, but does also add to the sleekness factor of the card. Now, I still personally like the RGB implementation on the 2080 Super. There's a bit more lighting there and definitely helps to make the card stand out more, whereas the 3080 has a more discreet implementation. One thing I will say though is that the diffusion of the LEDs on the 2080 Super is better than the 3080 because I could actually notice the individually lit LEDs, whereas on the 2080 Super, they weren't as noticeable and visually made the card more appealing due to how seamless the lighting looks. Now, as we move to the top of the card, you see more RGB lighting and the MSI logo, plus you have the GeForce RTX branding on the nameplate. But what sticks out is the very thick aluminum heatsink. The MSI RTX 3080 Gaming X Trio weighs 1,565 grams, whereas the 2080 Super weighs about 1,531 grams, a difference of 34 grams. While that might seem like a negative, it's mostly due to the larger heatsink MSI had to implement for their 3080, as that is what will ultimately help keep them slow and tame this power-hungry GPU. As you guys can see, the heatsink used consists of a very dense fin stack that should provide more surface area to cool, thus allowing for better heat dissipation. But while the heatsink is on the heavier side, MSI has included these anti-bending metal plates so that it doesn't strain or damage the PCB. The heatsink also incorporates these large copper heat pipes, which extend along through the heatsink and eventually converge and are machined together to directly cool the GPU die. Now, there's nothing wrong with having copper heat pipes in this formation, however, it can also have its drawbacks because then you will never truly have a flat finish, and there could be some small gaps in between the heat pipes that won't make contact with the GPU and will prevent them from thoroughly cooling. This can be solved by simply adding a solid nickel-plated copper base plate where the plate catches the heat from the GPU and transfers it to the heat pipes. MSI actually had used a copper base plate for the 2080 Super, so I'm just baffled as to why they didn't bother using the same cooling methods for the 3080, which would have definitely benefited from this design. As we make our way around to the back of the GPU, you can see here we have a black backplate with a white MSI logo. Now, MSI claims that this backplate is made out of a lightweight composite of graphene, which has some thermal conduction properties. Though to me, it just felt like regular old plastic, but what's interesting is that the 2080 Super uses an aluminum backplate, which to me looks better aesthetically and would also provide substantially better thermal benefits. So again, this is just another area where I honestly feel like MSI have cut some corners, and I'm wondering why, because it's not like the 3080 is a much cheaper card. In fact, this card was slightly more expensive here in Canada when compared to the 2080 Super. I would have just liked to see a regular old metal backplate instead of this so-called graphene one. Now, another thing I'll point out is that directly behind the GPU, you can see that MSI has used a combination of MLCCs and SP-Caps for the electrical noise filtering. I'm only pointing this out because we recently had that whole debacle surrounding these components where it was hypothesized that some AIBs had skimped out on the quality of these materials, and this resulted in stability issues where users were experiencing crashes. But a driver was released by NVIDIA 456.55 that had solved the crashing issues, so I don't think the capacitors used were the problem to begin with. Hence why you also never saw me make a video on this topic, because I just wasn't sure as to what was going on and I didn't want to spread any misinformation here. Needless to say, throughout my entire testing, I never experienced any crashes or stability issues with this card, outside of manual overclocking that is, so we're good here. So all in all, in terms of aesthetics, I feel like MSI have definitely nailed it down, and I was happy to see many of the design elements from the 2080 Super get carried forward for the 3080, as I was already a huge fan of that card. It's a nice looking graphics card for sure, the RGB implementation is on point without being overkill, and the card's build quality is robust. Cooling wise though, I feel like there is definitely some room for improvement. MSI could have used a copper base plate and a better back plate. But as you guys will see, it's not extremely detrimental to this card's performance in any way, so I won't harp on them too much for that. Let's move on to specifications of MSI's RTX 3080 Gaming X Trio. The 3080 is powered by NVIDIA's Ampere architecture. Now, if you guys want to know more about the changes they brought with Ampere, I highly recommend reading their white paper, and I have covered some of that information in my previous video, so I won't be going over that stuff here as there's a lot of data and benchmarks to cover, so I'll link those videos down below. The RTX 3080 is based on the GA102 chip, manufactured on Samsung's 8nm process. With a die size of 628mm square, this is definitely one of the largest consumer-grade GPUs brought to the market. Quite the behemoth when compared to previous generation X80 class cards. The GPU is packing 8,704 CUDA cores with a SM count of 68, 272 texture mapping units, and 96 render output units. Furthermore, the RTX 3080 also has dedicated ray tracing hardware, where the 3080 comes with 68 2nd-gen RT cores and also has 272 tensor cores, which can be used for features such as DLSS 2.0. This model has a base clock of 1440 MHz and a boost clock of 1815 MHz. Although, as you guys know from Pascal and Turing GPUs, with GPU boost, the card will definitely boost much higher if given the power and thermal headroom. In terms of memory, the card comes with 10 GB of GDDR6X that runs at a speed of 19 gigabits per second, sporting a wide 320-bit memory bus. As for the I/O, the card comes with 3 display ports, which are of the 1.4A standard, and 1 HDMI 2.1 port. That is great, so you could hook up your system to a 4K TV, which also has an HDMI 2.1 port for 120Hz and take advantage of that. I will also be making a video exploring that experience in the near future, so stay tuned for that. As for power requirements, MSI's RTX 3080 Gaming X Trio has a 3 8-pin power connector layout, but that third one is kind of useless because of this card's power limit, which is at 350 watts, so I'm confused as to why they did that. It's like they're tempting people to BIOS flash their card. Now, since I'm going to be comparing this card directly to the RTX 2080 Super, I might as well do a quick rundown of the specs for that GPU too. Built on NVIDIA's Turing architecture, the 2080 Super is based on the TU104 chip, which is manufactured on TSMC's 12nm process. With a die size of 545mm squared, the GPU is packing 3072 CUDA cores, 192 texture mapping units, and 64 ROPs. Along with that, the Turing GPUs were the first generation of GPUs from NVIDIA to also include dedicated ray tracing hardware, where the 2080 Super has 48 RT cores and 384 tensor cores. So quite a bit more than the 3080, but remember, these are older gen tensor cores, so not as efficient. The GPU has a core clock of 1650 MHz and an effective boost clock of 1845 MHz. In terms of memory, the card comes equipped with 8 GB of GDDR6 that runs at a speed of 15.5 gigabits per second. With a 256-bit memory bus, the GPU has a 250 watt TDP and comes with 2 8-pin power connectors. Moving forward, let's do a quick rundown of the test system I will be using to test the RTX 3080. For the CPU, we've got an AMD Ryzen 7 3800 XT, cooled by a Corsair H115i Pro XT 280mm AIO liquid cooler. For the RAM, we've got 16GB of G.Skill Trident Z memory, running at 3600 MHz with CL15 timings. The motherboard is an MSI MEG X570 Unify. For our storage device, we've got a 2TB Samsung 970 EVO Plus NVMe SSD. Powering the entire system is an EVGA G3 1000W 80 plus gold certified power supply, and for the case housing all the components, well, it's not really a case, it's more of an open test bench, is the InWin Alice. As for the operating system, we're running Windows 10 Pro with the 2004 update. For the drivers, we're using NVIDIA's Game Ready 456.55 package and the latest AMD chipset drivers. If you're interested in full system specs, check the video description down below. And if you want to see me put this test system together, I'll also link that video as well. Now that we've gotten specifications for the GPUs and the system out of the way, it's time we finally jumped into the performance data and benchmarks. To begin with, I wanted to first go over the frequency behavior of the MSI RTX Gaming X Trio, and how it performs out of the box. For this test, Hitman 2 was used with gameplay for about half an hour, so that would allow us to see what kind of load frequency behavior the cards would exhibit under a real-world load. At stock, the 3080 maintains an average boost frequency of around 1891 MHz, so that is well above what MSI advertises. We can see on the graph that the card's boost frequency ranges from the mid-1700s, going all the way up to 1980 MHz under this load, and with the card boosting more often to around the mid-1900s, so that's great. Now, when we overclock the card, we see a dramatic change in terms of boost frequency. Now, for my overclock settings, I was able to manage a plus 100 MHz offset for the core and plus 1000 MHz for the memory in MSI Afterburner. I did also utilize a user-defined fan curve when overclocking, as I found the stock fan curve to be a bit more on the conservative side, so therefore, that would prevent the GPU from truly seeing the benefits of the overclock, as with an overclock you can expect higher temps, and when that occurs the boost clocks go down, and so that would kind of defeat the whole purpose. With the overclock settings applied, the boost frequency maintained here on average is 2050 MHz, with the card in many portions running at a solid 2100 MHz. Of course, Silicon Lottery does play a role in all this, but I was quite pleased to see that. There are some dips, of course, which happen during scene changes, but for the most part, we're seeing substantially higher boost clocks sustained here by the card, and you'll notice that the frequency behavior also isn't as erratic and is more consistent. When we throw in the 2080 Super into the chart, there are some noteworthy things to look at here. At stock, the 2080 Super does manage to maintain higher boost frequency on average at around 1945 MHz, but this is probably due to the fact that it also ran cooler at stock. We'll get to thermals in just a moment. This allowed the 2080 Super to boost quite frequently into the mid to high 1900 MHz range, but it doesn't ever go over 2000 MHz. The frequency behavior was also more consistent here when compared to the stock 3080. Once the 2080 Super is overclocked, we now see it boosting quite frequently to around 2040 MHz, so less than the 3080, but the difference really isn't that huge. The main takeaway is that with the RTX 3000 series, Nvidia's Ampere architecture doesn't really behave differently in regards to frequency behavior and boost clock potentials when compared to Turing or even Pascal. But remember, clock speeds aren't everything. Performance goes much deeper than that. Moving on to thermals, and for this test, I decided to stress the cards using TimeSpy Extreme's second benchmark on loop for about an hour. We'll start by comparing stock configurations of the two graphics cards. The MSI RTX 3080 Gaming X Trio maintained an average GPU temperature of 71 degrees Celsius while peaking at 73 degrees Celsius. Meanwhile, the 2080 Super maintains an average GPU temperature of 68 degrees Celsius and peaking at 71 degrees Celsius. So that's a difference of around 4%, but do keep in mind that the 3080 has a considerably higher TDP at 320 watts versus 250 watts of the 2080 Super, which is a difference of 28%. The fact that we're only seeing a difference of 3 degrees for the average maintained temps is actually excellent, and that indicates that the cooler for the Gaming X Trio on the 3080 will do its job sufficiently. Now, I did mention earlier that I found the stock fan curve of the 3080 to be quite conservative, and for the overclock settings, I did use them with my own defined fan curve. With that configuration, temps dropped significantly, despite slightly higher power draw. We're seeing an average GPU temperature of around 62 degrees Celsius with a peak recorded temperature of 64, just from setting a slightly more aggressive fan curve. All the while, I found noise to be a non-issue, so if you're going to be getting this graphics card, I highly recommend just using your own fan curve. It only takes a couple of minutes to set up an MSI Afterburner and will give your card more thermal headroom, resulting in higher clocks, which should boost performance. The same goes for the 2080 Super as well. I was already quite impressed with the cooling and noise from this card, so I'm happy to see that the thermal performance and excellent acoustics have been carried over by MSI, so good job there. Up next, we're going to be taking a look at some GPU synthetic benchmarks, and first, I'm going to be going over all the benchmarks with just the GPUs at stock, and then we'll look at overclocked results later. First application on our list is 3DMark's Firestrike Ultra. This is a heavy graphics benchmark which utilizes the DirectX 11 API at 4K. When looking at the graphics cards, the RTX 3080 manages an impressive 10,983 score. Meanwhile, the RTX 2080 Super, that GPU scores 6,805, which results in a significant difference of around 61%. Not too bad. For our next test, we have TimeSpy Extreme, a benchmark similar to Firestrike, but this one utilizes the DirectX 12 API. Here, the 3080 scores 9,044, which is an even bigger lead than before, 65% faster than the 2080 Super, that manages to score 5,484. Next up, we have Unigen Superposition. Here, the 3080 gets a score of 14,889, and our 2080 Super gets a score of 9,608, a difference of 5,281 points, or 55%. So in the Unigen benchmark, the margins do close up a bit compared to what we saw from 3DMark's benchmarks. Now it's time for a couple real-world tests, and for our first test we have Blender, which is a very popular open-source 3D application used by content creators for producing work in areas such as 3D modeling, animation, simulation, and more. Blender can take advantage of Nvidia's CUDA platform to leverage these graphics cards to accelerate rendering. We're using the Classroom benchmark here, and as you guys can see, Blender absolutely loves Nvidia's Ampere architecture. The RTX 3080 completed the render in just 73 seconds. Meanwhile, it took the 2080 Super to complete the same render in just 162 seconds. That's a very significant difference in terms of performance, where the 3080 is over twice as fast when compared to the previous generation RTX 2080 Super. So excellent showing for the Ampere GPU here. Next up, we have V-Ray, a computer-generated imagery rendering software application developed by Bulgarian Chaos Group. It's a great piece of 3D technology that can be implemented within widely used programs throughout the animation and modeling industry. The V-Ray benchmark was done using only the GPU, and here the program measures how long it will take your hardware to render the scene, and this is done by measuring the amount of MPATs. Here, the RTX 3080 scores 639 MPATs, leaving the RTX 2080 Super in the dust, which only manages 274 MPATs. That's a massive difference of around 233%. If there's one thing we know for sure, it's that content creators and heavy compute workstation applications would most definitely see much higher performance out of the RTX 3080 and the Ampere architecture. So from these synthetic benchmarks and a couple of real-world content creation apps, we've seen how much faster the RTX 3080 is, with performance deltas from 55% all the way to over 200%. But let's see if these huge performance gains translate well into gaming performance. So starting with our gaming benchmarks, we have Shadow of the Tomb Raider, a beautiful third-person action-adventure title. Please note all the gaming benchmarks were tested at two resolutions, 1440p and 4K. As for settings, most games were tested with their highest presets available, with post-processing features like motion blur turned off for obvious reasons. In Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1440p, the RTX 3080 manages 157 FPS for the average frame rate and 117 FPS for the 1% lows. Meanwhile, we see the RTX 2080 Super attain an average frame rate of 106 FPS and 94 for the 1% lows, a difference of 48% for the averages and 25% for the 1% lows. So you'll definitely have a more smoother experience with the 3080 at 1440p, especially if you're playing at a high refresh rate. With that said though, the performance of the RTX 2080 Super isn't bad either, and you still have a pretty good time here as well. At 4K, we can definitely see the game become a lot more demanding on these two GPUs, and overall FPS figures drop across the board. The RTX 3080 now only averages about 89 FPS and attains 83 FPS for the 1% lows, while the RTX 2080 Super dips just below that 60 FPS mark to 59 FPS average and gets 55 FPS for the 1% lows. So here the margin for the average frame rate does widen up a bit more to 51%. If you want to have the smoothest experience at 4K without sacrificing too much visual quality, then you'll definitely want to play this title with the 3080. Now the 2080 Super can still deliver a playable experience at 4K. Also note that this game does support ray tracing, but we won't be going over any ray tracing performance benchmarks in this video, as I'll be making a separate video analyzing features like RTX and DLSS. Moving on to our next title, which is Hitman 2. I personally found this game to be very fun to play. Just being able to approach each mission, each target, and being able to assassinate them in whatever way you like makes it quite thrilling. At 1440p, the RTX 3080 averages a frame rate of 103 frames per second and gets 70 for the 1% lows. Meanwhile, the RTX 2080 Super isn't too far behind, managing 94 FPS average and 71 for the 1% lows. So in terms of 1% lows, we're pretty much tied, and for the average frame rate, the 3080 is only a mere 10% faster at 1440p, which is quite the difference from what we saw in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. But what happens when we bump up the resolution to 4K? Here we can see the 3080 average 85 FPS and 62 for the 1% lows, whereas the 2080 Super only manages a 58 FPS average and 51 for the 1% lows. So now all of a sudden the gap has widened dramatically to 47%, just bumping up the resolution and making it even harder on the GPU. Grand Theft Auto 5 is the next game on our list, and this game is still one of the most popular open world games still played to this day. I mean, it's definitely an old title, over 5 years old at this point, for the PC release that is, and if you go back to the first time it released for consoles, that was about 7 years ago, so it's definitely getting there in terms of its age. But like I said, it still has a very high player count on Steam, and so I thought that would be a good reason to include it in my benchmark suite. When we take a look at the benchmark results at 1440p, we can see that at this resolution, the 3080 is barely faster than the 2080 Super. We're looking at just a difference of 2 frames per second for the average frame rate. That's barely going to be noticeable. It's margin of error stuff. The 1% lows, however, are more in favor of the 3080. Here the gap is 13%. But at 1440p, this game really doesn't care about having a faster GPU. Now, when we go to the 4K resolution, the delta is quite significant. We're looking at a significant difference of around 59% in favor of the RTX 3080 when we compare the average frame rates. What I will say is that you'll see this as a recurring theme, where at 1440p, the margins might not be as large as you'd expect them to be, but when we increase the resolution and are more GPU bound, then the gap widens, but we'll discuss that in more detail once we've gone over all the benchmarks. Ashes of the Benchmark is next, and this is a pretty cool looking RTS title that's optimized fairly well and can take advantage of high-end hardware. Fast GPUs, multi-core processors, the engine scales pretty well. At 1440p, we can see that the 3080 averages 94 FPS and gets 70 for the 1% lows, and the 2080 Super averages 77 frames per second and 54 for the 1% lows. So we're looking at a difference of around 22% for the average frame rates, and comparing the 1% lows, the difference is 30%. At 4K, we see see the margins for the average frame rate widen a bit more. The difference here is 25% for the average frame rate, as the 3080 gets 84 FPS and the 2080 Super gets 67 FPS. The difference for the 1% lows is 18% higher at this resolution as well. Assassin's Creed Odyssey is next up on our list of games. This title has been known to bring even the most fastest GPUs to their knees, and you guys can see it manages to do the same here. At 1440p, the 3080 only manages an average frame rate of just 86 FPS and attains 55 for the 1% lows. With the 2080 Super, it only manages an average frame rate just slightly above that 60 FPS mark at 63, but the 1% lows are noticeably lower at 49 FPS, so consistency for smoothness could be a bit of an issue here. We're seeing a difference of around 37% for the averages, so in this game, at least we're seeing a large margin than usual between the two cards at 1440p. At 4K, the 2080 Super's performance is just barely passable for what I'd call a playable experience, where it only manages to get 43 FPS average and the lows are at 37 FPS. The 3080 maintains 44% higher FPS for the average frame rate and is 32% faster for the 1% lows. So if you really like this title and want a good smooth experience with all the visual eye candy, then the 3080 will definitely be the card you want here. The next game we're going to be taking a look at is Far Cry 5. At 1440p, the 3080 scores an average FPS of 130, which is 15% faster than the 113 FPS average of the 2080 Super. Although we do see considerably higher 1% lows as well, we're looking at an 18% difference there. Once we're at 4K though, this is where the 3080 truly shines. We're seeing it maintain 94 FPS average, which is a whopping 52% faster than the 2080 Super, and 38% faster when comparing the 1% lows. That's not to say that the 2080 Super can't game at 4K with this title. It definitely can, as it just gets above 60 FPS for the average, but if you're going to be playing this first-person shooter on a high refresh panel, then the 3080 will be much better in that regard. Since Far Cry New Dawn is the next iteration in the series, I thought I'd include that as well. However, at 1440p, we're seeing a much different story. The 3080 is only a mere 4% faster than the 2080 Super, and the 1% lows are pretty much within margin of error. However, at 4K, we then start to see the same kind of performance deltas between these two cards as we did with Far Cry 5, where the 3080 here manages a fast 91 FPS average over the 64 FPS average of the 2080 Super, a 42% difference, where we were practically almost tied at 1440p. Funny how that works. It's a Ubisoft frenzy right now, and the next game we have is The Division 2, and this game actually shows us some much better GPU scaling. At 1440p, the 3080 delivers 130 FPS average and 91 FPS for the 1% lows, whereas the 2080 Super gets 86 FPS average and 70 for the 1% lows. So even at this lower resolution, we're looking at a massive difference, 56% lead for the 3080 when comparing the average frame rates, and 30% for the 1% lows. At 4K, the margins are pretty much the same, 57% for the average frame rate, but we do see a higher difference for the 1% lows at 53%. With that said though, the 2080 Super wouldn't be delivering the smoothest experience in this title at 4K with the Ultra preset, whereas the 3080 really wouldn't have an issue. I always like to include a racing title in my benchmarks, and Forza Horizon 4 is one of my personal favorites. It's a great open world title with gorgeous visual quality, and to top it off, it's optimized fairly well. At 1440p, we see both cards put up some very respectable numbers. The 3080 manages an average frame rate of 165 FPS average, with 1% lows at 122 FPS. And the 2080 Super is only 14% and 7% behind respectively, managing 145 FPS average and 114 FPS for the 1% lows. Not too bad. Both cards would deliver a buttery smooth experience in this title at this resolution. At 4K, and we're still seeing some fairly high performance numbers here from both GPUs, although the gap has widened quite a bit, where now the 3080 is 41% faster than the 2080 Super for the average frame rate, and in regards to the 1% lows, the 3080 is 30% faster. Regardless, at 4K, either of these two GPUs can deliver a fantastic experience with all the visual setups, as you'll still get a pretty smooth experience and you'll be able to enjoy fantastic visuals. Gears of War 5 is the next title on our list, another one of Microsoft's beloved IPs, and one of my personal favorites as I've been playing the titles from this series since my 360 days. Gears 5 is another title that shows some pretty good performance with the GPUs. At 1440p, we can see a considerable difference in terms of the averages between these two cards, at 36% and 25% for the 1% lows. Now, when we shift our focus to 4K, something interesting happens and we see the margins close up a bit, where the 3080 manages an average frame rate of 81 FPS and the 2080 Super gets 63, so that's a difference of just 29%. Weird, I was expecting the margins to widen up again, as we saw with all of our previous games. The same happens for the 1% lows, there's a difference of just 19% there. Horizon Zero Dawn, a Sony exclusive brought over to the PC with much anticipation due to it being considered a phenomenal game. The port, however, didn't get the best treatment, and there were quite a lot of bugs and issues with this game at launch in regards to performance, but have been resolved through patches. At 1440p, we're seeing pretty good performance figures for the 3080, and we can see this GPU attain an average FPS of 124 and 81 for the 1% lows, whereas the 2080 Super shows us considerably lower performance at 77 FPS and 51 for the 1% lows. That's a massive difference of 61% for the average and 59% for the 1% lows. Interestingly though, the margins do close up again at 4K, where the differences for the average frame rate and 1% lows is 56% and 52% respectively. Although the 3080 at this resolution would deliver a much smoother experience, and the 2080 Super is again delivering sub-playable experience in my opinion, so I would suggest lowering settings or, go down a resolution. Middle of Earth Shadow of War is next, and here the 3080 is showing some pretty good performance figures at 1440p, where it gets 155 FPS average, which results in a 52% lead over the 2080 Super's 102 FPS average. Then for the 1% lows, we're seeing a difference of around 43%. Running the game at a higher resolution like 4K sees the 3080 pull away even further, showing a 68% advantage for the average frame rate and a 56% advantage in terms of the 1% lows. Definitely some huge margins when comparing these two graphics cards. This game really seems to scale well with the RTX 30 series GPU. Ghost Recon Wildlands is another title from Ubisoft that's been known to be quite demanding on GPUs, where even the previous gen RTX 2080 Super just barely managed to break the 60 FPS mark at 1440p by attaining 62 FPS average, and we do see some dips down into the low 50s. The 3080 definitely does help smooth out performance, maintaining an average frame rate of 83 FPS and gets 68 for the 1% lows, so a smoother experience will be delivered by the 3080. At 4K and the 2080 Super really seems to be struggling to deliver only 40 FPS average, but the 3080 also seems to be struggling as well, as it only manages to attain 55 FPS average, a difference of 38%. I don't know, this game doesn't visually look spectacular, so I'm not sure as to why it runs so horribly. It's pretty badly optimized. Borderlands 3 is next on our list of gaming benchmarks, and at 1440p, this title shows the biggest difference from the rest of the games in the list. Here, the RTX 3080 has a whopping 77% lead over the RTX 2080 Super. This title seems to run really well on the Ampere-based GPU. Even the 1% lows show a pretty big margin at 35%. The experience on the 3080 would be a lot smoother here as opposed to the experience you'd get on the 2080 Super. When we look at how performance is in this title at 4K, we're seeing similar margins with a higher resolution. The RTX 3080 averages a frame rate that is 70% higher than the RTX 2080 Super, with dips into the low 50s for the 1% lows and average frame rate in the mid 60s. The experience should be just right with optimal performance. However, the same cannot be said for the RTX 2080 Super, looking at an average frame rate of around 39 and 1% lows dip below 30 FPS. So at 4K, the 2080 Super wouldn't be able to deliver the most smoothest experience, and it would be recommended to either lower settings or go back to 1440p. World of Tanks Encore runs on a newly developed engine running on the DirectX 11 API and supports features such as ray tracing on all DX11 GPUs, which is really neat. At 1440p, we can see both the GPUs perform exceptionally well, putting out figures that would allow for a very buttery smooth experience. The RTX 3080 managed to attain an average frame rate of 266 FPS and gets 169 FPS for the 1% lows. The RTX 2080 Super is 54% behind, however, when it gets 173 frames per second average and 112 for the 1% lows, it's still going to be delivering a great experience. At 4K, and the performance is still pretty good for the most part. The RTX 3080 and 2080 Super maintain averages of 132 FPS and 86 FPS respectively, so again, we're seeing the exact same 54% difference. For the 1% lows, we're looking at a 52% difference. Regardless, at this higher res, both GPUs are completely capable of giving you a great experience. The last game on our list is The Witcher 3, another title which is among the older ones from our list, released back in 2015. However, the reason why I still included it is because it's still considered one of the best action RPGs to date, still looks phenomenal, and has been known to scale well with hardware. At 1440p, we can see in The Witcher 3, the RTX 3080 leads to 2080 Super by a 26% margin when comparing the average frame rates. So not the biggest difference, and we're seeing an even smaller margin for the 1% lows. Now, once we get to 4K, the margin between the two GPUs for the average frames per second grows to 48%, and the 1% lows are also much higher for the faster Ampere GPU at 27%. Still, the 2080 Super is a very much capable GPU in this title. It's just that for the best experience, you're definitely going to want the 3080. Alright, so now that we've gone over all the gaming benchmarks, let's take a look at the 16 game averages starting with 1440p. The RTX 3080 manages an average frame rate of 131 FPS and 90 FPS for the 1% lows. For the 2080 Super, in terms of the average FPS and 1% lows, we're seeing 99 FPS and 73 FPS respectively. That's a difference of around 32 FPS for the average frame rate and 23% for the 1% lows. So with all the hype surrounding the Ampere architecture and bold claims such as 2x the performance of a 2080, we're not exactly seeing that translate to gaming at 1440p. This could be due to a few various reasons, but before we talk about that, let's just quickly look at the differences at 4K. So at a higher resolution of 3840 by 2160, the RTX 3080 led the 2080 Super here by a much larger margin. We're talking about a 48% difference, up 16% from the lower res, and the 1% lows margin also increases to 37%. I can confidently say that if you're a 4K gamer looking to play the latest AAA titles with the highest graphical features and want to sustain high or playable frame rates, then the RTX 3080 is a phenomenal performer in that regard. But notice how with a simple increase in resolution, we're seeing the full potential of the RTX 3080, whereas when we circle back to 1440p, the margins aren't really that big, and looking at this from a generation on generation improvement, it's not something really to write home about. We did see quite a lot of titles such as GTA 5, Hitman 2, and Far Cry New Dawn, which showed little to no performance improvements using an RTX 3080 over the 2080 Super at 1440p. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this is an architectural limit or if we're hitting a hard CPU bottleneck somewhere, or if it's a combination of those things, but I'm leaning towards this being an architectural limit. You see, Ampere is quite a bit different from Turing, where the SM configurations has been changed quite drastically. The increase in FP32 shaders from Turing really only sees the full benefit at heavier resolutions like 4K. Along with that, 3840 by 2160 has traditionally always been heavier on the GPU, putting practically 99.9% of the load on the GPU. Therefore, if there were any other system bottlenecks, whether it's your RAM or CPU, it would be diminished here, and not too much of a concern for most games. With that said though, if you're someone who's on a previous generation GPU like the 2070 Super, 2080, or 2080 Ti, or even a 1080 Ti, and you're gaming at lower resolutions like 1440p or even 1080p, then I'll say the jump to the RTX 3080 probably isn't worth it, as those cards will still be able to game just fine at those resolutions and still put up some fairly high figures in most games. However, at 4K, this is where the 3080 truly shines. The performance jump here from the 2080 Super is quite substantial and is one of the sole reasons as to why I was very interested in this graphics card. As someone who plays on a 4K 120Hz LG C9 OLED TV, the 3080 was practically made to have these two paired up as the perfect duo. Along with that, the fact that it has HDMI 2.1 and so does the TV, then I'll also be able to enjoy 4K gaming with great visuals and have a buttery smooth experience thanks to the higher refresh rate. Oh, and let's also not forget that the C9 does support G-Sync. But generation on generation, we're seeing a pretty good performance uplift here at 4K, one that is definitely a lot better than what we got from Turing, that's for sure. Along with that, prices for the X80 GPUs are the same. We're still at that $699 price point. However, one of the things to keep in mind is that the 2080 and 2080 Super were based on the smaller TU104 die, whereas the 3080 is based on the larger GO102 chip. So the chips have been shifted back down in the GPU hierarchy, so that's also why we're seeing such a substantial performance uplift this time around. Not that I'm complaining though. In fact, I'm happy to see that consumers once again don't have to shell out $1,000 for the top die. Now, of course, there might be users who may be coming from an even lower end or mid-range GPUs like say a GTX 1060, RX 480, or something like a GTX 1660 Super. And if you were looking to jump to 4K, then yeah, the upgrade would be totally worth it. But like I said, if you're satisfied with 1080p or 1440p but just want a higher frame rate for high refresh gaming, then I'd say you're better off waiting for the upcoming RTX 3070 or 3060, or perhaps even trying your luck with the used market and picking up a 2080 Super or 2080 Ti for cheap. It's going to be interesting to see how things play out once we see reviews of the upcoming RTX 3070 graphics card. I'm going to presume that at 1440p, the card might not be that far behind the RTX 3080, and in many cases might actually even tie it, since we just saw how in 3 games the 2080 Super delivered almost exactly the same performance as the 3080. Now, another area I wanted to talk about was overclocking, and how much an RTX 3080 can improve performance once overclocked. As you guys saw with my frequency behavior data earlier in the video, that in a game like Hitman 2, my overclocked 3080 could sustain 2100 MHz, and we were also able to get the memory overclocked by a full 1000 MHz. Usually for my GPU reviews, I always include overclocked performance data throughout the entire benchmark suite, but I had a good reason for not doing that this time around, and you'll see why in just a moment. First up though, let's take a look at a couple of synthetic benchmarks, starting off with 3D Mark Firestrike Ultra. The 3080 overclocked pushed the graphics score to 11,340, up from 10,983, a difference of just 3%. The 2080 Super showed a slightly larger gain at 5%. Then with the Time Spy Extreme benchmark, we're looking at a performance boost of around 6% for the 3080, and the 2080 Super also again manages a slightly larger gain at around 8%. So we're not seeing huge performance gains out of these overclocks so far. Let's take a look at Blender, and here the overclocked 3080 was just a mere 2 seconds faster in completing the render over the stock 3080. Meanwhile, we're seeing the 2080 Super decrease its render time by a larger margin at just 11 seconds. Now, what about games? Do they benefit at all from overclocking the RTX 3080? Well, sadly, no. I'm just going to quickly go through these benchmarks because the results practically speak for themselves. I mean, in Shadow the Tomb Raider, it doesn't matter whether it was 4K or 1440p, the 3080 is practically within margin of error. It's the same thing with Hitman 2. You won't notice these performance changes at all. However, you can also see this being the case for the 2080 Super as well. GTA 5 shows us the exact same story. Absolutely no noticeable performance gains for either of these two GPUs. And at first, I thought, while benchmarking, I thought maybe at 1440p we won't see the full benefits, but maybe at a higher resolution like 4K we'll see the cards working to their full potential, but no, I was wrong to assume that, and even at 4K there are no noteworthy changes. So despite being able to get my 3080 to hit 2100 MHz or close to there, it doesn't really boost performance by a whole lot, if at all. And before anyone thinks that I might have pushed this error correcting memory too hard, and that might be negatively impacting performance, don't worry, I used programs like Unigine Heaven and watched the FPS counter while I was playing around with memory, and I also did multiple runs of the Firestrike and Time Spy benchmark and took notes of these scores. I found a 1000 MHz offset to the memory was the sweet spot, as anything above or less gave me lower performance. So what this tells me is that these cards really don't benefit a whole lot from overclocking, as they already come well pushed to their limits out of the box. I mean, we did see both cards hover around 1900 MHz, so by adding on another 100 or 200 MHz isn't really going to do much, and I don't think their memory bandwidth starved either. But speaking of limits, let's move on to power consumption as the final segment for this review. Here the GPU power draw was measured and logged using hardware info, while having Time Spy Extreme's second graphics test on loop for about an hour. At stock, we can see the average power consumption by the RTX 3080 noted at 337 watts and peaked at 342 watts, which is very close to the power limit. Then once overclocked, we're looking at 5 watts more for the average, and the card seems to be hitting its power limit here at 350 watts. Now while the RTX 3080 definitely showed some impressive performance improvements over the RTX 2080 Super in gaming, in some cases as much as 77%, and on average it was about 48%, it definitely doesn't come without a cost. However, the 2080 Super stock consumes around 30% less power when comparing the stock configuration. So this tells us that performance per watt is indeed good, however, it's definitely nowhere near the 1.9x claim that Nvidia made. The 2080 Super also peaked slightly less than 300 watts, so it can also be considered quite a power-hungry GPU. So for the RTX 3080, if you plan on getting this GPU, you have a high-end CPU, and you plan on overclocking, I'd say you'll need a quality 750 watt power supply as the minimum. If you're interested, I'll leave a link down below to some suggestions. Now, what I will say is that MSI should have definitely allowed for a higher power limit on this card, as even the Founders Edition model comes with a 370 watt power limit. So I'm hoping that they take note of this concern and perhaps release an updated BIOS to help edge out a bit more performance. Perhaps I might explore BIOS flashing this GPU and experimenting with it that way in a future video. Who knows, perhaps this card, despite running so power hungry, is still power starved. Well, there it is guys, my review of the MSI RTX 3080 Gaming X Trio. It took longer than expected, but I just had so much to say about this card and still have a lot more to talk about and explore in other future videos, so stay tuned. Would I recommend this card? I absolutely would, especially if you're someone who's in my shoes looking to play at 4K with no compromises and wants a great GPU with HDMI 2.1. The card is constructed fairly well with a few minor drawbacks that aren't detrimental at all to its performance. It's quiet under load, and with an even more aggressive fan curve, acoustics aren't an issue. It's aesthetically a great looking card, can fit in with most builds with no issues, just make sure your case is large enough. And to top it all off, it sure does deliver some damn good gaming performance, and is also excellent for rendering too. I hope you guys found this video to be informative and helpful. Let me know your thoughts down below. Check out the video description on ways to support the channel and for my other videos. If you guys are interested in more content like this, then make sure you subscribe. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you guys in the next one.